Now, as we commence the last half of lesson number 9, I want to ask you a question. How many males in our audience belong to the state militia? That's fine. Now, how many of you are between the ages of 17 and 44 inclusive? Now, you see what we have? Several times more. Usually when I ask people if they belong to the state militia, they think I mean the National Guard. But you see, the law provides that every male 17 to 44 is automatically a member of the state militia and can be called up either by the governor or by the president. And by the way, if the Equal Rights Amendment passed, the so-called Equal Rights Amendment passed, then it would include all females, and that's your second blank. First blank is male, second blank is female. Now, if you sign up for the National Guard, you'll notice that you sign up for not only the National Guard, but your own state militia, which you automatically belong to anyway, as well as the Army Reserve. You sign up for all three when you go into the National Guard. You probably noticed that, those of you who held up your hands in the beginning. Now, the militia is used for three purposes by the federal government. Actually, the governor can call up the militia to help in flood problems or anything else that comes along. The federal government, however, is not to call them up unless they are to be used for insurrection. Your number one is insurrection, which means civil strife. Insurrection. During the 60s, you'll remember when we had over 100 American cities burning during that rioting and so forth, the militia had to be called out many times. Number two, it's to repel an invasion from the outside, of course. Insurrection is inside, and then invasion is from some force on the outside. Or number three, to execute the laws of the United States. And that's where some large section of the country or something the police or the U.S. Marshals cannot handle, then the militia is called up in order to help get it done. Now, I want you to notice one thing, that the president has no authority to call up the militia. Only the Congress. The people's representatives must do it. And this is in order to keep the military under civilian control. Now, do you see any indication there that there is authority to call up the militia to send abroad to fight in wars? See any indication of that? When World War I broke out, that was a very serious question, whether there was any authority to send Americans abroad to fight in somebody else's war. And it's still questionable whether it was constitutional. Actually, there were many people at the time who felt it was a great mistake. But for, I would say, about 10 or 15 years prior to World War I, there had been a group of intellectuals and others, some very wealthy and influential, who had been agitating for American involvement in foreign affairs. And instead of taking the posture of the founding fathers, which Switzerland had used, and not being isolationist, but being, that is, not engaging in entangling alliances, we started that whole pattern of entangling alliances in World War I. We've never recovered from it. And it's become more and more complicated all the time. And some authorities are now pointing out that if you look back over the history of our country during this century, our involvement in foreign problems hasn't really solved anything. And we probably would have done much better if we had stayed a great moral strength, and then after people had settled their quarrels, we would have been able to nurse the wounds of both sides and say to them, you see, it didn't accomplish a thing. War wasn't really that much of an advantage to you, and now let's go for universal peace and prosperity and work together. Instead, we've taken sides, and now the world is very seriously divided, with the United States vacillating back and forth, trying to decide whose side we're really on. We, as Americans, need to take a good, hard look at the Founding Fathers' original policy. Now, the Congress has the responsibility of passing laws and appropriating money for the militia so that they can be trained uniformly. In other words, some states may not have the money or not feel they have the money to get their militia up to speed. And so the Congress provides the money for their equipment and their training so that it will be uniform throughout the country. And the state gets to appoint its officers in charge of the militia, but when the militia is called up, of course, it's put under the officers appointed by the federal government. But the state officers remain in command of their various units. Now, the Congress was given complete authority over a 10-mile square area to be selected at a later date, which would be the nation's capital. This turned out to be Washington, D.C. At first it was New York, then it was Philadelphia. Finally, we ended up in a rather swampy area on the banks of the Potomac, which they knew could be drained and made into a beautiful city, which it has. It was the hope of Washington that not far from here would be the new industrial center of the United States. That didn't turn out, but anyway, the capital was put where it was a nice, even arrangement between the North and the South. Now, the idea was to have the capital where it would prevent violence. We wouldn't have violence from the local citizenry because it would be under the control of Congress and they could immediately suppress it. They had violence when the capital was in Philadelphia, and the local police were not able to handle it, and the idea was that Congress would be able to. However, we have a bit of a problem here. There have been riots in Washington, and the Congress did less to suppress it and take control of it than happened in most other cities. So that doesn't quite add up. Now, there's been a great drive in Washington for some years in order to give the population of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in federal elections. And finally, the 23rd Amendment, and that's your blank, under B, 23rd Amendment was passed so that they could vote for the president and the vice president. Now there's been an additional drive to see if they can't get 2 senators and a congressman for these 800,000 people that now live in the District of Columbia. The people that have been promoting that have been suspected of trying to establish a precedent where they would be sure that they had one additional congressman and 2 additional senators who would be liberal, who would constantly vote for stronger central government in Washington, because that's the pattern in the Washington population. Washington, D.C. has what we call a liberal type of philosophy. Liberal originally meant to liberate the people from the control of government, but today the word liberal means the federal government should intervene in the solving of problems. So the word liberal there in capital B is your blank. Now, another proposed amendment has now been passed by the House and the Senate along these lines that I've just been mentioning. The House and the Senate has already approved 2 senators and a congressman for Washington, D.C. And of course, it's absolutely unconstitutional in concept, and it violates one major provision in the Constitution, which I can perhaps mention a little bit later. But it's now gone out to the states to see if they will approve it, and apparently they're not going to, because it's a ridiculous situation to give a city 2 senators and a congressman as though they were a state. What about New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, etc.? All right, now we come to a very interesting one. The federal government is authorized in this provision to occupy certain areas within each state if it has the permission of the state legislatures. There are certain things it can do to arrange for federal forts, arsenals, and so forth. And the Constitution says specifically what the federal government can occupy land within a state for. That is the purposes for which it can have land within the state. And so your first blank, A, is forts, arsenals, which is where we store our armaments, and along the coast for dockyards, 2 words, dockyards, and D for other needful buildings such as post offices and federal courthouses and that sort of thing. Now let me ask you, any provision there for national forests? Any provision for national parks? Any provision for wilderness areas? Now, a strange phenomenon has occurred in our country. It began in the late 1800s, and the idea was to somehow justify the taking over large sections of land and occupying it as national parks, national forests, etc. And I can understand the rationale that went behind that, but it hasn't turned out. Studies show that that probably was a maneuver in the wrong direction. I have to tell you something else, too. The federal government got so hungry for the grasping of land in the 1800s that, and a little later too, that as the western states tried to come in, they strong-armed each of those states into giving up half or more of their land before they'd let them in as states. All right, now the Northwest Ordinance passed in 1787 said that all the new states should come in equal with the original states. And that happened, you see, all along all the Northwest Territory, all up into those states all came in equal. All of those states over in the Louisiana Purchase came in equal. But in the western part of the United States that came in as a result of the Mexican War, they were every one of them strong-armed into giving up vast territories, which was really unconstitutional and contrary to the program. And so suddenly Americans in the West have asked the rest of the nation to give them back what belonged to them in the first place. And I've listed here for you the percentages, etc. Under number 2, I suppose you wrote in no. Now look down here under number 3 and notice how much land the federal government retained that it had no authority to do. 45% of Arizona, 45% of California, 36% of Colorado, 64% of Idaho, 30% of Montana, 87% of Nevada, 35% of New Mexico, 52% of Oregon, 66% of Utah, 30% of the state of Washington, 96% of Alaska. They set up a great vast territory. They said, this is the great state of Alaska. Then the federal government retained 96% of it and said to the people of Alaska, you can only have that 4% to settle and mine and develop. This is totally unconstitutional. And since that time, the federal government has been going out and taking certain territories, declaring it wilderness, and it can't be mined, it can't be developed, the forest can't be harvested, etc. Now, studies are being made, and we're finding out that the state forests are better, they have fewer forest fires and are better kept than the national forests. State parks, generally speaking, are cleaner and have better facilities and are better cared for than national parks. And now there's a great drive to bring this thing back where it originally belonged. And the newspapers have called it the Sagebrush Rebellion, but that's really not what it is. It's just simply that the people feel they've been imposed upon. Now, there was a man sitting in an audience just like this about 5 years ago. And he had cowboy boots on, and I had no idea who he was. He came up afterwards and he said, now go over this again with me. So I did. I went over it again. He said, now we ought to start a program to get that land back, shouldn't we? And I said, really, by rights, we should. It's going to be tough. Do you know the next thing I was receiving in the mail copies of resolutions passed by the Cattlemen's Association and this association and that association that this man was campaigning and getting passed. I found he was a national officer of the Cattlemen's Association. His name was Bert Smith. And he finally got that thing generated to the point where the state of Arizona, good friend of his there, Dean Rhodes, put into the state legislature of Nevada, I should say, a piece of legislation that demanded back their land. And that, of course, throws it into the courts. Now all the western states are doing the same, and the papers have called it the Sagebrush Rebellion. It isn't a rebellion, it's just a request, and it's being done in an orderly way to get that land back. The states will handle it better. All the studies show that. Now in Nebraska and states like that, the federal government has about 1% of the land. 2% in some of the states, or 3%. Nothing like we have in Utah, 66%. All right, now, in order to carry out all of the above powers, the Congress is authorized to do whatever is necessary and proper. Those are your words. You see, here were 20 or 19 powers, rather, and they needed one more so that in case they hadn't thought of some detail, why, they'd be able to do what's necessary and proper. Let me ask you about a Navy. Anything about in the Constitution that the Navy can have submarines? Doesn't say it, does it? But that's necessary and proper. How about airplanes? Is that necessary and proper? Yeah, sure it is. All right. Now, Section 9 of Article 1 then is interesting because it put restrictions on the federal government. Now, on the Congress, there's some things that Congress cannot do. And the first one is they can't do anything about slavery until after 1808. And they can't put a higher tax on slaves than $10 that are being imported, because the power to tax is the power to prevent. And it was the southern states, particularly Virginia, that wanted to eliminate slavery. So your first blank is 1808 under this one, and then $10. Only one family out of 17 even had slaves in the South. Now, these beautiful mansions and plantations, as all of you know, but only actually one family out of 17. It was generally agreed now that slavery had to go, and they thought that by 20 years they could phase it out. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But it was decided that if the South would accept interstate commerce, which it had been resisting, then the North would allow slavery to be postponed for that many more years, 20 years. So B is interstate commerce. Now the Congress, got that written in? Interstate commerce. All right, now the Congress cannot suspend habeas corpus unless there's an insurrection or an invasion. Will you put insurrection or invasion there under Roman numeral 2? What's habeas corpus? Habeas corpus is a court order to the jailer to bring the body before the court. And the jailer may say, well, we've got Dr. Skousen down here in the dungeon, but he has an attorney to represent him. No, habeas corpus, that means have the body, bring him in here. Want to see whether his wrists are chafed, you know, and whether he's keeping up his normal weight. It'd be terrible to lose that. All right, that's what that is. Habeas corpus, the right to be brought in. They can't hold you illegally, you see, in jail without a cause. And then the Congress cannot pass a bill of attainder. Let me spell it for you. A-T-T-A-I-N-D-E-R, attainder. That's an act of the legislature. Did you get that? A-T-T-A-I-N-D-E-R. That's an act of the legislature convicting a person of a crime without a trial or a hearing. Isn't that terrible? Parliament did it all the time, or quite frequently. Without a trial or a hearing. That's the next two blanks. They'd have an individual and they declare him an outlaw, or they declare him guilty of treason. They just pass an act. He's guilty of treason. Hang him, quarter him, boil him in oil. Well, the Congress can never do that over here. All right, now the word attaint means touch. You've heard of criminals saying somebody was fingered, you know, etc. This is what it means. The Parliament touches him on the forehead and said, you are an outlaw, we convict you. You see, that's attainder. Everybody got that now? These are terms that we seldom use. Now, it's also provided that the Congress can never pass an ex post facto law. And that's making thing a crime after it occurred. All right? It can't, that's ex post facto, after the fact. And it's ex post facto to make a crime more serious. from a misdemeanor to a felony, or the penalty more severe. So your first blank is serious there. And then the second two blanks, more severe. Or deprives the individual of some protection which he formerly had. Some protection. Now, under Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, the Congress is prohibited from assessing a head tax or other direct tax on the people without assessing it uniformly according to the population. That's why the income tax required an amendment. You couldn't do it uniformly and population. If you're going to have any direct tax, now a direct tax is against you. For example, your income, your house, your carriages, cars, etc. That's what you personally have, and that's pointing the finger at you. It's called a direct tax. Indirect taxes are where the taxes are on things, articles of merchandise, and those who buy the merchandise pay the tax, but that's indirect. It's not on you. Now, that can't be done unless it's done uniformly based on population. All right, the Congress is forbidden to put a tax or a duty on any article being exported from a state. That's tax or duty on any exports from a state. And that's to enjoy the free flow of goods, you see. You put a federal tax on oranges out of California, Arizona, or Florida, it'll slow them down, will it not, if they export them. So they just try to sell them locally so they don't have to pay the tax. You follow that? They don't want that, the founder said. Nor can they give preference of one port over another. Congress is forbidden to give preference to one port over another. And under Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, no money can be drawn from the Treasury of the United States without a specific appropriation by Congress. Appropriation. You've got to be able to say on what basis you're spending that money. Who authorized that? When was it authorized? What bill or act? And then it has to be published. That's your next blank. It has to be published. Published. Now, they didn't want any state or the Congress allowing anybody to have a title of nobility. We don't want any class structure in the United States. So nobility is your next one. We don't want any Sir Henrys and so forth running around. Now, in Canada, where I was born, they do allow that. And it does make a difference. It's amazing back there in the Parliament there in Canada, if they say, Sir John is coming now, you know. I just noticed it does make a difference. The American founders didn't want any titles of nobility, not allowed. All right, Section 10. The states also need to be prohibited from doing certain things. Some things are absolutely forbidden, other things they can do, but only with the consent of Congress, and that's your blank. So let's fill in some of these things the states absolutely cannot do. They absolutely cannot enter into any treaty, that's A, with another nation. Wouldn't that be awful if the states were going around entering into private treaties with other countries? All right, nor grant letters of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, marque and reprisal. Now remember, that's an authorization of a private citizen to go out and fight the war. For supposing California said we'll give letters of marque and reprisal to our fishing vessels, they can go out and attack the Japanese fishing vessels. We'd immediately be into an international altercation. So they don't want any of the states doing that. The states cannot coin money. And they can't print paper money. And they can't use anything but gold or silver to pay their debts. Now, you see, in 1933, that was absolutely wiped out, unconstitutionally, without an amendment, just by an act of Congress as they took us off the gold standard. They had no authority to do that. Came up before the courts, too, but the court went right along with it. It was a bad, as far as the Constitution was concerned, that was an unfortunate period. Now, they can't pass any bill of attainder convicting a person of a crime without a hearing, you see, or a trial. That was something Parliament did. We didn't want that in the United States. They can't pass an ex post facto law, and that makes that one right. We know that should be so. They can't pass a law which impairs private contracts. They can't grant any title of nobility. That's good. You don't want any titles of nobility among the states. Maine was doing that, by the way, before the Revolution. Now, here's the things the states can do, but they have to have the consent of Congress. They can set up duties or imports, or on imports or exports, only when it's for making inspections. And if they charge for it, it has to go to the Treasury, U.S. Treasury. California did that for many years, so did Arizona. They cannot, without the consent of Congress, lay duty on tonnage coming into a port to pay for the cost of keeping up the port. Capital C, they can't maintain troops or ships of war in time of peace except with the consent of Congress. Sometimes on a border situation, like Texas had it for a while, they were allowed to maintain armed forces. And then they can't enter into any agreement or compact with another state without the consent of Congress. And that's a real good one because, do you know, all of the rainwater that goes down the Colorado River falls on 3 states: Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. And what if those 3 states entered into a compact and said, you know, we really shouldn't have any more erosion down the Grand Canyon. We'll just dam off all the water that falls on our 3 beautiful states. We'll sell it. Now, are they allowed to do that? No, not without the consent of Congress. So what happens? They have to go into Congress, and guess who's there? They got some stinkers from Nevada, California, Arizona, through which the Grand Canyon goes, you see. They got to be in on the act, and so they are. And so you have a compact of all those states so that that water is equitably distributed. Isn't that good? You see, the founders thought of all these little details. That's what thrills me about those 4 months, I'll tell you, were well spent. Well, they can't launch into a war unless invaded or in such imminent danger that there is no time or opportunity to obtain the consent of Congress. Well, now that brings us now to the conclusion of lessons 8 and 9, and that's a great period of our history when we decided we'd give at least that many powers to the federal government. But federal government has spilled over now, and we've got to get it back under control and in channels. Now, our next lesson, which is lesson number 10, you're going to find an interesting one because the President of the United States has now become the most powerful political person in the world. And this is quite different than the Founding Fathers intended, but that's the facts of the case. And so that's our lesson number 10, the most powerful political office in the world, the President of the United States. Thank you.